Picture this, you're a world-renowned scientist in 1869. You've just discovered the most incredible sea monster fossil ever found. You carefully reconstruct this 40-foot marine beast, publish your findings, and present it to the scientific community with absolute confidence. There's just one tiny problem. You put the head where the tail should be. And that embarrassing mistake, well, it started a legendary feud that would define paleontology for decades. But here's what's really wild. That wasn't even the worst case of scientists getting prehistoric creatures completely, utterly, spectacularly wrong. There's this guy named Edward Cope, smart guy, respected scientist. The year is 1869 and he's got his hands on something incredible, a massive marine reptile fossil that's gonna make him famous. Again, this thing is huge. We're talking 40 feet of prehistoric nightmare with the longest neck anyone has ever seen. Cope is practically vibrating with excitement. He's about to show the world what real paleontology looks like. Here's where things get good. Cope looks at this endless string of neck bones, all 72 of them, and his brain just breaks. See, nobody had ever found a reptile with a neck this long ever. So Cope does what any reasonable person would do when faced with the impossible. He decides it's not a neck at all. Nope, those 72 vertebrae, that's obviously the tail. The little short section, that's the neck. It makes perfect sense. Head goes on the short end, tail goes on the long end. Elementary, my dear Watson. So Cope publishes his findings, puts out drawings, gives lectures, shows off his short-necked sea monster to anyone who'll listen. He's riding high. Enter Nathaniel Marsh, Cope's biggest rival and the kind of guy who probably corrects your grammar at parties. Marsh takes one look at Cope's reconstruction and starts laughing, and not just polite scientist chuckling, full-blown tears streaming down his face laughing, because Cope had mounted a 40-foot marine reptile with its head on backwards. The humiliation was instant and brutal. Marsh made sure everyone knew about Cope's little mix-up. Academic conferences became roast sessions. Scientific journals turned into gossip rags. This one mistake launched what historians now call the Bone Wars. Basically a decades-long feud between two grown men who really should have known better. But here's the thing that'll blow your mind. Again, this backwards head wasn't even the weirdest case of scientists getting prehistoric creatures wrong, because wait till you see the spiral of death that stumped experts for over a century. Picture finding a perfect spiral of razor-sharp teeth and having absolutely no clue what animal they came from. Well, that's exactly what happened in 1899 when scientists unearthed the first Helicoprion fossil. They stared at this thing for months, turned it upside down, held it up to the light, and nothing. At first, they thought it was some kind of shell. You know, one of those spiral snail things. Completely reasonable guess, except for one teensy tiny detail. Shells aren't usually made of teeth designed to slice through flesh. If this thing was a snail, it was basically built like a Beyblade, except that Beyblade was made of razor blades. Yeah, if you find a snail like that out there, someone has messed up horribly in the evolution chain. Once they figured out it was actually a mouthful of nightmares, the real fun began. Scientists spent the next century playing the world's most disturbing game of pin the tail on the donkey, except instead of a tail, it was a buzzsaw made of teeth, and instead of a donkey, it was some unknown prehistoric monster. The first theory? Well, it's a nose saw. Obviously, this thing had a circular saw sticking out of its face. That makes perfect sense. Terrifying, but logical. Well, that didn't work out, so they tried mounting it on the tail. Maybe it was some kind of defensive weapon like a medieval flail, but with more teeth and worse intentions. Still, it looked ridiculous. Well, how about the dorsal fin? Yeah, let's put the death spiral on the back. That'll show those other fish who's boss. Nope. For over 100 years, scientists kept moving this thing around trying to find where it belonged. Museums had to keep updating their displays. Textbooks got rewritten every decade. Kids probably thought prehistoric sharks had just random buzzsaws attached to various body parts. The poor thing looked different in every reconstruction. Sometimes it had the saw nose. Sometimes it was tail powered. One version made it look less like a predator and more like a rejected Power Rangers villain. Then 2013 happened. CT scans finally revealed the truth, and it was way weirder than anyone guessed. The spiral wasn't sticking out at all. It was hidden inside the throat, working as some kind of organic meat slicer. But Soviet scientists had an even more interesting theory about 3-foot claws that they found while digging. Finding 3-foot claws in the Mongolian desert could only mean one thing: giant turtle. At least that's what Soviet scientist Yevgeny Maleev decided in the 1950s. He took one look at those massive talons and thought, obviously this thing lived in the ocean and used these claws to harvest seaweed. You know, normal turtle stuff. Maliv was so confident in his turtle theory that he created an entire new family of turtles just for this creature. He called it Therizinosaurus, which means reaping lizard, because apparently even the name had to sound like farming equipment. The whole scientific community just went with it. Textbooks got updated, museums built displays. For 25 years, everyone agreed that somewhere in prehistoric oceans, there swam a turtle the size of a school bus with claws that could slice through steel. Nobody questioned this. Nobody said, hey, maybe we should double check the whole turtle thing. Nope, giant seaweed harvesting turtle it was. Think about that for a second. Grown adults with advanced degrees looked at claws longer than baseball bats and decided they belong to something that eats plants underwater. That's the scientific process that works, folks. The turtle theory finally died in the 1980s when paleontologists found more bones. Turns out Therizinosaurus wasn't a turtle at all. Shocking development, I know. It was a dinosaur, a theropod actually, the same group that gave us the T-Rex and Velociraptor, except this one decided to go full hippie and eat plants instead of meat. And those 3-foot claws, they weren't for harvesting seaweed. They were for pulling down tree branches and maybe convincing other dinosaurs to leave it alone. Hard to argue with something that has switchblades for fingers. And the most interesting part too, Therizinosaurus probably had feathers. So we went from imagining a giant turtle swimming around the ocean to a 30-foot tall feathered dinosaur that looked like Big Bird's nightmare cousin. 25 years of being completely wrong about something, and all because someone couldn't imagine claws that big on anything except a turtle. Speaking of getting the animal completely wrong, meet the king lizard that ruled ancient seas. Basilosaurus means king lizard, which is awkward because it's actually a whale, but we're stuck with the name forever because of scientific red tape. See, back in 1834, Richard Harlan found these massive fossil bones in Alabama and immediately thought giant sea serpent. He slapped the name Basilosaurus on it and called it a day. 5 years later, Richard Owen examined the same bones and noticed something weird. The teeth had 2 roots. Reptiles don't have 2-rooted teeth. Mammals do. Owen tried to fix the mistake. He suggested renaming it to Zeglodon, which actually meant whale. Science has rules about this stuff. First name wins, even if it's completely wrong, because if you found it, you get the naming rights. So now we have an 80-foot whale named King Lizard swimming around the history books, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. The whole lizard thing made sense at first glance. Basilosaurus was huge and serpentine with a tiny head. It looked exactly what you would expect from a prehistoric sea monster. Museums mounted it with flippers in the wrong places. Artists drew it breathing fire. Kids probably had nightmares about the king lizard coming to eat them. Nobody wanted to admit they'd been calling a whale lizard for decades. Even after the evidence piled up, some scientists kept insisting it had to be some kind of reptile, because changing your mind is apparently harder than defying basic biology. The real Basilosaurus was actually terrifying in completely different ways. This thing didn't breathe fire or crush ships. It hunted other whales. Fossil evidence shows Basilosaurus' stomach contents included smaller whales that it had apparently swallowed whole. Imagine being a whale getting eaten by something called king lizard. That's just adding insult to injury. This thing was basically prehistoric Shamu. And the funniest part, Basilosaurus still had tiny back legs, that useless little flippers hanging off its rear end that served no purpose except to remind everyone that whales used to walk on land. That's evolution's way of keeping receipts. But at least they got the basic animal right, unlike the gentle giants that apparently spent their whole lives in the swamps. For 50 years, everyone knew exactly how Brontosaurus lived. These massive creatures spent their days standing around in swamps because they were too heavy for dry land, and they used their long necks as snorkels. It made perfect sense to the intellectual scientific community. Something that weighs 30 tons obviously can't walk around on solid ground without sinking into the earth. Water would be able to support all of that weight. Plus, look at that neck. It's clearly designed for breathing while submerged up to the eyeballs. Museums built entire exhibits around this idea. Artists painted countless pictures of herds of Brontosauruses lounging in prehistoric lakes, necks sticking up like periscopes. Kids grew up thinking dinosaurs were basically really big hippos. Charles R. Knight painted the definitive Brontosaurus in 1897, and it's standing chest deep in water looking completely at home. That painting influenced how people saw dinosaurs for decades, as lazy giants who couldn't be bothered to leave the pool. There was just one small problem with this whole theory: physics. Water pressure increases as you go deeper. Everyone knows this. You feel it in your ears when you dive to the bottom of a swimming pool. Now imagine being a 30-ton animal trying to breathe through a tube while your chest is squeezed by tons of water pressure. Your lungs would collapse instantly. You'd suffocate before you could take a single breath. But nobody thought about this for half a century. Scientists just accepted that these dinosaurs lived close to underwater because the alternative seemed impossible. When researchers finally tested the theory, they realized Brontosaurus could absolutely support its weight on land. Their leg bones were thick and strong, and their feet were wide and padded. Everything about their build screamed land animal. The neck that everyone thought was a snorkel, well, it was actually used to reach the top of large plants to eat more food. And that tail everyone drew dragging behind them, well, they held it up off the ground, probably using it for balance and as a weapon against anything stupid enough to attack a 30-ton herbivore. Even the name was wrong for decades until scientists figured out Brontosaurus might be different from Apatosaurus after all. But at least they didn't spend 60 years calling it a baby-eating monster. You know what is a baby-eating monster though? The Coelophysis rex. This is my dog Flapjack, and he's actually a rare breed of dinosaur called the Coelophysis rex. He says if you don't like this video and subscribe to the channel, he's gonna eat your babies. I don't make the rules. Right now in the New York City subway system, there's a mosaic showing a Coelophysis eating its own baby. It's been there for decades. Thousands of people see it every day, but it's completely wrong. This whole cannibal thing started in the 1950s when Edwin Colbert found a mass grave of Coelophysis skeletons at Ghost Ranch, New Mexico. Hundreds of these little dinosaurs had died together, probably from a drought or flooding. Inside the ribcage of two adults, Colbert found small bones. His conclusion: these dinosaurs had been snacking on their own kids right before they died. Case closed. The story spread everywhere. Textbooks included gruesome illustrations of adult Coelophysis tearing apart juveniles. Museums put up displays about dinosaur cannibalism. Scientists wrote papers about this aberrant behavior. For 60 years, Coelophysis was the poster child for prehistoric family dysfunction. Nobody bothered to double check the evidence until 2006. When researchers finally took another look at those Ghost Ranch fossils, they found two major problems with the cannibalism theory. Problem 1, the gut contents weren't actually inside the stomach. The bones were underneath the adult skeleton. The bigger dinosaur had just fallen on top of a smaller one, which is death by crushing, not death by eating. Problem 2, the small bones weren't even from baby Coelophysis. One was from an early crocodile. The other were too big and the wrong shape to be Coelophysis babies. So what actually happened? Well, an adult Coelophysis ate a small crocodile for lunch, then died in a mass extinction event, which is normal predatory behavior, not family cannibalism. The correction got published in scientific journals, researchers updated their papers, and the cannibalism theory officially died. But the subway mosaic is still there. Textbooks still mention it sometimes, and the internet is full of cannibal dinosaur articles that never got updated. Ultimately, most museum displays have been fixed, mostly, and scientific papers now cite the correction. But changing public perception, that takes forever. I mean, just go up to anyone on the street and ask them how big a velociraptor is. They're probably gonna say about as tall as a tall human being or a little bit taller, when that is so far from the truth. Why do people think that? Jurassic Park. Anyways, Coelophysis went from normal little predator to baby-eating monster and back to normal predator, all because someone misidentified lunch is infanticide. But good thing they didn't try to figure out where this dinosaur's long neck actually belonged. Scientists spent 120 years arguing about where one reptile lived, not what it ate, not how it reproduced, just whether it spent time on land or in the water. This became paleontology's longest running debate, and it all started with the Tanystropheus and its absolutely ridiculous neck. This thing's neck was 3 times longer than the rest of its body. Imagine a 6-foot tall person with an 18-foot neck and you get the idea. For reference, I am 6'2". Now imagine my neck is that long. When researchers first found Tanystropheus fossils in the 1800s, they didn't even know what they were looking at. Some thought the neck bones came from a flying reptile. Others assumed they belonged to multiple different animals that just happened to die in the same spot. Once they figured out it was all one creature, the real arguments began. Team Land said it lived on shore and used its neck to reach into water and grab fish. Think of a giraffe, but for fishing instead of eating leaves from tall trees. Team Water insisted it was fully aquatic. The neck would stick up above the surface while the body stayed hidden underwater, waiting to ambush prey. But both teams had problems. The land people couldn't explain how something with such a long, stiff neck could walk around without falling over, and the water people couldn't figure out how it would swim with that giant neck creating drag. For decades, textbooks would change their stance depending on which scientist wrote them. Museums kept updating their displays. Kids probably learned different things about Tanystropheus depending on what year they visited the museum. But the whole debate finally ended pretty recently in 2020 when CT scans revealed the truth. Tanystropheus had nostrils on top of its head and teeth designed for catching slippery prey, which are classic water adaptations. The neck wasn't for reaching up to breathe, it was for stealth hunting. The body would stay motionless in shallow water while the neck slowly moved into position. No ripples, no movement, just a head appearing out of nowhere to grab unsuspecting fish. It only took them 120 years to figure out that the giant neck was basically a prehistoric periscope. Meanwhile, other scientists were convinced that bone-crushing jaws meant a vegetarian diet. Thylacoleo had teeth that could crush bone and claws that could slice through steel. Naturally, scientists decided it was a gentle fruit eater. This made sense to them somehow at the time. Sure, it had the strongest bite force of any mammal ever discovered, and yes, those retractable thumb claws were perfectly designed for ripping flesh, but it was a marsupial, and marsupials just weren't supposed to be apex predators. Richard Owen first described Thylacoleo in 1859 and correctly identified it as a carnivore. He looked at those massive slicing teeth and those bear trap jaws and said, yeah, this thing definitely killed stuff. But other scientists weren't having it. They took one look at Thylacoleo's dental arrangement and declared it was obviously adapted for cracking nuts and eating melons. Those huge premolars weren't for shearing meat. They were for processing tough plant material. For 150 years, scientific papers went back and forth on this. Team Carnivore would publish evidence of meat-eating adaptations, and Team Vegetarian would publish rebuttals about fruit processing teeth. Museums couldn't decide how to display it even. Some showed Thylacoleo stalking prey with its massive claws extended. Others showed it peacefully munching on prehistoric produce. The whole debate was frankly ridiculous. This animal had forward-facing eyes for judging distance when attacking prey. It had powerful forelimbs for wrestling down large animals. Everything about Thylacoleo screamed, I kill things for a living. But the fruit-eating theory persisted because scientists had preconceptions about what marsupials could and couldn't do. In their minds, only placental mammals could be true apex predators. It's funny how most of these things we got wrong about prehistoric animals all boil down to a scientist was too stubborn to admit they were wrong. Anyways, cave evidence finally settled the debate in 2016. Researchers found claw marks showing Thylacoleo could climb rock faces and ambush prey from above. They also found bite marks on prehistoric kangaroo bones that matched Thylacoleo's teeth perfectly. So no more melon munching marsupial. Thylacoleo was officially recognized as Australia's premier predator, capable of taking down animals twice its size. Sometimes the obvious answer really is the right one, even when it challenges what stubborn scientists want to believe. And funny enough, Charles Darwin faced the same problem with his weirdest discovery in South America. Charles Darwin discovered Macrauchenia in 1834 and immediately regretted it. Not because it wasn't interesting, the thing was fascinating. Camel-sized body, horse-like legs, elephant trunk, and feet that belonged on something completely different. Darwin just had no clue what he was looking at. This drove him nuts. He's the guy who would eventually figure out how all life on Earth evolved, and he couldn't even classify one weird fossil from Argentina. Darwin wrote letters to other scientists asking for help. He sent drawings. He described every bone in detail, and nobody had any answers. Scientists spent the next 180 years playing Guess the Animal with Macrauchenia. First, they stuck it with the camels. Made sense. Similar size, long neck, lived in South America where llamas and alpacas hang out. That didn't work. The teeth were wrong. The feet were wrong. The skull had those weird nasal openings high up on the forehead, suggesting some kind of trunk. So they tried elephants. Again, the trunk thing seemed obvious. Plus, it was big and heavy enough to be related to prehistoric elephants. But nope. Wrong teeth again, wrong everything actually. Back to camels, then horses, then back to elephants. Scientists kept moving Macrauchenia around the family tree every few decades, hoping something would stick. Museums had to keep updating their displays, textbooks got rewritten constantly, and kids again learned 5 different things about what Macrauchenia was related to, depending on what time period they went to school. The whole mystery finally got solved in 2017 when scientists extracted actual DNA from Macrauchenia bones. Ancient DNA is incredibly rare, so this was huge. And the results? Macrauchenia was most closely related to horses and rhinos. not camels, not elephants, not anything anyone had guessed for nearly 2 centuries. It had split off from the common ancestor about 66 million years ago and evolved completely separately in South America. No wonder nobody could place it. It was the last member of an entire group of animals that had no living relatives. Darwin's fossil that stumped everyone was literally one of a kind. Speaking of size creating confusion, let's talk about the 10-foot tall animal's teeth that sparked Bigfoot legends. Giant teeth started showing up in Chinese pharmacies in the 1930s. The shopkeepers called them dragon bones and sold them as traditional medicine. Ralph von Kongswald walked into one of these shops, took one look at these massive molars, and realized they came from the largest primate that ever lived. The teeth were enormous, double the size of gorilla teeth. Whatever creature they came from had to be at least 10 feet tall when standing upright. Early researchers immediately wondered if this was some kind of prehistoric human ancestor. Franz Weidenreich became convinced that Gigantopithecus was a giant early human, a massive ape man that might explain folklore about giants and monsters. This idea caught fire. If giant humanoid primates lived in Asia until recently, maybe some of them survived. Maybe they were still out there, and maybe people weren't crazy when they reported seeing Bigfoot or Yeti. Cryptozoologists went wild. Here was possible evidence that giant human-like creatures actually existed. The whole Bigfoot phenomenon got a scientific boost from Gigantopithecus discoveries. Scientists couldn't agree on what it looked like though. Some imagined a 10-foot tall gorilla walking upright. Others pictured something more human-like but covered in fur. But everyone agreed it was massive and probably bipedal. Museums built displays showing giant ape men roaming Asian forests. Books featured artworks of enormous humanoid creatures that looked ready to star in monster movies. But there was just one problem with all of these theories. They were based entirely on teeth and jaw fragments. Nobody had found any other bones at the time. When researchers finally got more complete fossil evidence, the giant human theory collapsed. Gigantopithecus was definitely an ape, closely related to orangutans actually, and it probably moved on all fours when it bothered to move at all. And what did this 10-foot monster eat? Plants. Specifically, bamboo. Lots and lots of bamboo. So much for the terrifying giant human ancestor. Gigantopithecus was more like a supersized panda. Huge, plant-eating, and probably too lazy to chase anything. But the real giant human story was actually happening in Europe at the time with much smaller bones. Fun fact, every single caveman costume you've ever seen is actually based on one old guy with really bad joints. Marcel Boule examined a Neanderthal skeleton in 1911, decided these ancient humans were bent-kneed, knuckle-dragging brutes who shuffled around caves grunting at each other. His description became the official scientific position for 60 years and led to the biggest scientific movie of our time, The Croods. Anyways, textbooks showed stupid-looking cavemen, museums built displays of dim-witted primitives, and Hollywood made movies about club-wielding Neanderthals who could barely walk upright. The whole brutish caveman thing entered popular culture and never left. Even today, calling someone a Neanderthal means they're stupid and primitive. Fun fact, I got my DNA tested one time and it said I was 2% Neanderthal. Why am I sharing this online? I don't know. Hopefully the comments don't run with it. But there was one tiny detail Boule missed. The skeleton he studied belonged to an old Neanderthal with severe arthritis. The bent spine and worn joints weren't normal Neanderthal anatomy. They were signs of an elderly individual with joint disease. Boule basically looked at a really old guy with back problems and concluded that's how an entire species normally looked. By the 1950s, other scientists started pointing out the obvious problems with the theory. William Strauss and A.G.E. Cave re-examined the skeleton and found clear evidence of pathology. If this Neanderthal walked with bent knees, it was because of arthritis, not evolution. But the damage was done. The bent-kneed caveman image had spread everywhere, and scientific corrections don't make for good movie plots. And like, have you seen The Croods? The Croods is such a good movie. Honestly, don't change The Croods. Change everything else, keep The Croods the way it is. In fact, modern research shows Neanderthals actually stood completely upright. They had brains as large as ours, sometimes larger. They made sophisticated tools, controlled fire, and buried their dead with flowers and personal items. They wore jewelry, they painted cave walls, they had complex social structures, and probably spoke languages as advanced as early modern humans. Oh, and they didn't even live in caves full time. Most Neanderthal sites are outdoor camps near rivers and hunting grounds. The cave thing was just preservation bias. Bones survive better underground. And even more interesting, we even interbred with them. People of non-African ancestry carry Neanderthal DNA. Ancestors thought Neanderthals were attractive enough to have kids with. That's literally how I exist, with that 2% in my DNA. Somewhere in my history that happened. And if you all got your DNA tested, I can almost guarantee a third of you probably have the same type of thing going on. So ultimately, one arthritic skeleton created a stereotype that lasted a century and still influences how we see ancient humans today. And that's the real lesson here. Sometimes the biggest scientific mistakes become the hardest myths to kill and really damage the public's perception on what prehistory was actually like. And you want to know what the really funny thing is? We're definitely doing the exact same thing right now. I guarantee right now, somewhere in a museum, there's probably dozens of dinosaurs mounted incorrectly, all because we don't have enough information yet to understand what they were actually like. Come back to this video in 10 years from now, and how many dinosaurs are going to be updated? Probably lots, but that's what makes this so interesting to talk about, is because as we get farther in the future, we just keep learning more about our past. If you enjoyed this video and thought you learned something, make sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this. Comment down below what other prehistoric animals you want me to talk about, and if you want to watch more content just like this, you should watch the video on screen now.